Jamaica is a highly prospective target area for different kinds of deposits in an island arc terrain.
As probably the most widespread, intensive, and in-depth exploration program that's ever been carried out in this island.
5 or 6 years worth of work into just 2.
No one else has ever done this before. There has been historic work on the island, trending back 150 years.
I think they're getting excited, as we are, so stay tuned.
Yes, hello, and I would like to welcome everyone to Minds and Money's panel discussion on environmental, social, and governance. With the world now a year into the pandemic, what is the outlook on ESG for the mining industry and natural resource investors? But first, let me introduce the panelists who present both the buy side and the sell side, and then jump into the questions with a brief summary at the end. Many of you know Ani Markova, who is an independent director of Silver Crest Metals, a precious metals exploration company that is focused on Mexico's historic precious metal district, and Golden Star Resources, a gold producer that owns and operates the Wassa gold mine situated on the prolific Ashanti gold belt in Ghana. Ani is a senior executive with predominant focus on qualitative and quantitative financial analysis, capital allocation, and marketing over the last 2 decades. She is an award-winning portfolio manager and has spent more than 15 years investing in the global mining sector and commodity markets while at AGF Investments. Throughout her investment career, she has been engaged with environmental, social, and governance topics and the integration of such factors into the investment decision-making process. Ani holds an MBA from George Washington, chartered financial analyst, Canadian investment management, and corporate board international designations. Welcome, Ani. It's a pleasure to have you on this panel and look forward to hearing from you firsthand experience in driving an ESG agenda at the board level.
Glad to be here.
Our second panelist is Amanda van Dijk, who's the managing director of Arch Emerging Markets Partners. Arch is a specialist investment advisor with deep experience in emerging markets, private equity, asset management, and legal and governance matters over many decades. Amanda joined Arch last year and is responsible for developing the sustainable commodities strategy. Amanda has over 20 years experience in the commodities market and most recently managed UCITS Gold and Precious Metals Fund. She has also published significant research on governance in the global mining sector. Amanda holds an MBA and Master's in International Economics from SDA Bocconi and China Europe International Business School. Welcome, Amanda. It's a pleasure to have you on this panel and really keen to learn about your strategic ESG outlook.
Thank you.
Nikolai Christoph, and excuse if that's the right pronunciation, not quite right. Nikolai, how do I say this properly?
You can call me Nikki, that also works.
Great. So Nikolai, Vice President, Sustainable and External Relations at Dundee Precious Metals, starting as a metallurgist in 2004. Nikki moved through a variety of increasingly more senior roles before assuming the role of Vice President and General Manager at the Chilopak mine in Bulgaria in 2011. During his tenure as VP and GM Nikolai not only doubled the production of the mine, but also played a central role working with a diverse group of stakeholders, gaining critical experience for his current role. Prior to joining Dundee, he held positions in mining processing, as well as research and development. Nikolai obtained both a Master's of Science and PhD in mineral processing from the University of Mining and Geology in Sofia. Welcome, Nikolai. It's a pleasure to have you on the panel.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
And hang on. Last but not least, Alex Shai. I would like to introduce you. You are the Director of Research from the Emerging Markets Investor Alliance, which is a not-for-profit organization that enables institutional emerging market investors to support good governance, promote sustainable development, and improve investment performance in the governments and companies in which they invest. Alex has 20 years of experience identifying and valuing investment opportunities in developing markets. Prior to joining the Alliance, Alex served as a managing director of Ultima Thule, an equity research firm covering frontier markets with a special emphasis on analyzing political and corporate governance risk. He also served as lead emerging markets finance director and chief risk officers for WK Associates, an energy and industrial markets company that he co-founded in 2002. Before that, Alex worked at Credit Suisse with the Global Financial Strategy Group, where he authored reports and supported the implementation of Credit Suisse firm-wide valuation initiatives. Alex earned both an MS in risk management and an MBA from the New York University Stern School. Pleasure to have you with us, Matt.
Thanks very much.
And then finally, a few words about myself. Carsten Heide, I'm a director with Partners in Performance, a global management consulting firm. We are thought partners to mining executives in strategic planning, business transformation, technology, and performance management with a strong focus on sustainability. Driven by value, we work with our clients to increase productivity, transfer skills into the line, manage community relations, and reduce the environmental footprint. I worked with many clients across the Americas, Europe, CIS, Middle East, Australia, and China. And in a prior life, I was a researcher and hold a PhD in physics from Oxford University, and also spent some time at NYU, like Alex did. So let me jump right in with some questions. With the world really now into the pandemic mode for about a year, it appears that ESG investing is in fact weathering the situation very well. Are these ESG commitments here to stay? And to be more specific, have investors been more or less likely to ease up on ESG commitments when compared to other factors such as dividend payments or profit margins? And maybe I'll just start with Anne.
Very nice to be the first to open the panel discussion. I hope everybody else will jump in with their comments. My perception is that over the past few years, there has been an increased interest in having more disclosures around ESG factors. And that really comes from the investors' priorities of assessing all risks associated with the business models. And certainly now seeing that more than $100 trillion of assets under management has committed to integrate such factors into their investment processes, more and more definitions of what is ESG factor, how does that impact businesses is coming forward. I'm happy to say that now the integration of ESG research and decision-making is making its way in the broad investment community. It's not only institutional shareholders, it's also retail shareholders who are interested in investing in the right businesses, in the right companies. We've seen, for example, fourfold increase in the inflows in ESG ETFs last year, and about $650 billion of estimated funds will be available for green bonds, sustainability bonds, and social bonds this year. So this is an indication that there is a huge pent-up demand in channeling capital in ways that investors see will benefit not only the environment, but other social areas as well. And mining is so fundamental to the success of the future. So we have actually done quite well in progressing disclosures in areas where we've excelled. And I'm sure we can have a discussion later on. But ESG is here to stay. And I am very, very happy that we are on our path to meet those information demands from the investors.
Amanda, you look like you want to answer to that.
I completely agree with Annie regarding the disclosures that are now required, and that disclosures are, I think, only going to get higher, not lower. But to take a bit of a step back, I think that there's been a bit of things have changed since the pandemic, and this has been slowly happening for years. But fundamentally, the rapid growth that we experienced in the last 50 years was done without consideration of the cost of that growth when it came to the environment, and often and how it was developed in terms of emerging markets and in terms of local stuff. And I think that generally what consumers are saying, from retail investors to institutional investors to private equity investors that we speak to, is they want growth, but they don't want growth anymore at any cost. They're willing to pay for ESG, and they're willing to pay for the people who invest on their behalf to ensure it. They want the way we do it to change. And something about the pandemic kind of called stop somehow on, I'm not sure why, I think it was like a tipping point, but there's, at least in Europe, we've had a real sense of build it back better. If we're going, we know we want to grow, but we don't want to grow at any cost. And we want to make sure how we do things in future at every level is sustainable. And the first way you do that is, excuse the expression, but putting your money where your mouth is. And investors are doing that. And the people who invest on their behalf, the funds and the institutional investors, are passing that on. I think there is a little bit of a lag in terms of what is sustainability, how do we report on it, how do we make sure it's done? And I think it has potentially confused some of the miners, because previously shareholders only really asked for profits and dividends, and the off-takers, like let's say car companies, only wanted a sustainable, they wanted a supply, but they never asked sustainability questions before. So there is a bit of a catch up and a disconnect in terms of the industry figuring out how to respond to their stakeholders in terms of sustainability. But I think that this is a trend and it's not going anywhere. I think it's very permanent.
So I think you gave a good point there on the mining side. And over the last year, what I've seen many of my clients stepping in during the pandemic to become the provider of last resort to many of the local communities in which they operate. Personally, I found that very encouraging. Would you be able to share your experience of similar cases? And Nikolai, since you're sort of from the mining side, maybe you can give a few.
Thanks, Carson. I just wanted to pick up a little bit on the first question as well, and I agree with Amanda and Annie, and just building on why is this happening. And if you look at the now, more than half of the working population in North America consists of millennials. And if you think about the millennials generation grew up with largely the two layers of the Maslow pyramid being fulfilled. And when you have this to my generation or earlier generation, you have a different pattern of how you make decisions. And what Amanda was in terms of professional money managers directing now the flows of capitals, I think this is as well as a result from the questions that they're getting from every individual person who is saving money for their retirement or inherited money that they need to manage as well. And the questions that are being asked are completely different to what they used to be before. And I think what we see today, over the last few years, we have seen quite a fundamental change in how people view things. I would outline this as probably, in my view at least, one of the fundamental drivers of what we see today. And again, building on the argument that ESG is here to stay, is actually coincides with the companies who have a better ESG performance, which is obviously as a result of the understanding what the ESG means and building that, integrating that into the strategy and the purpose of those businesses. They actually have a better financial performance as well. So ESG is here to stay, and we will see more and more coming into the next few years. Getting back to your question, I think as a mining industry, we should be quite proud actually in terms of how we were able to react in the pandemic. The mining industry have been building risk management systems and processes for many years. And now when the pandemic hit, anyone had a very sort of well-planned action sort of plan, or well-thought-through action plan in all the details. However, building on the muscle of risk management that our business have developed over the last years, we were able very quickly to react and adapt, and we were very happy to be able to also help the local communities. And examples of just from the industries, we were not only contributing financial support to the local authorities who were needing various things. And for example, we've built a COVID section in the Tsumeb hospital. But I'm more proud of us being able to partner with those local authorities and help them with this risk management approach, and help them to walk through the various challenges that are coming. And in this way, working collaboratively with them, really helping that ecosystem where our operations are to handle better the challenge that we all faced.
Alex, do you from a frontier market perspective, what have you seen?
Yeah, no, so we have some interesting kind of data points there, and I would completely echo what Amanda said. In a kind of perverse way, the twin elements of pandemic and social unrest have been kind of an accelerant for ESG in financial circles, and it's obviously shined a spotlight on health and well-being of employees, obviously frontline employees, as well as diversity and inclusion. But as I was saying, one data point that's interesting, we've been conducting an EM, Institutional Investor Conference, on EM ESG since 2016. And it's funny, at that time, the headline was ESG is becoming mainstream, right? And we've had a bit of a joke in the ensuing years, we could just replace the marketing document every time. No, it's really, really becoming mainstream. And the next year, no, it's really, really, really becoming mainstream. So, and last December, our event, which was sponsored by JP Morgan and HSBC and AllianceBernstein, upwards of 400 institutional investors, the attendees, we didn't even need to mention it because it'd become obvious to all the participants. And so, I think that three trends, and even back in 2019 in December at the excellent Minds and Money London event, we kind of emphasized 3 points for miners from the investor perspective, that their initial interest was on ESG funds, and we were saying, look, it's not about the 2,500 or so ESG funds that are out there. It's really about mainstream investors and broad-based ESG integration. And that movement, as Amanda mentioned, I think with the PRI data, or actually I think it was Annie, there's 80 trillion in assets now have pledged, those six to endorse those 6 principles. That's a significant movement. Now it has no teeth, but there is annual reporting that they have to do. And PRI is actually now upgrading how they do those assessments, because increasingly firms that get A+ are touting that. It's becoming an incentive, a marketing incentive for them to tout that, which is kind of a positive feedback loop. But the trend that capital is kind of minimizing its exposure to ESG harms, especially in mining, is very important. It's going to continue. And the buy and sell side are both kind of coalescing around similar evaluation metrics, which is making the market pricing of these risks a little more efficient moving forward. And all these things are gonna keep happening.
Annie, sorry, or Amanda, go ahead.
I was just going to come back on the question, this specific question about mines directly helping with COVID relief and that sort of thing. I've, in a number of the companies that I cover and follow, there's a thing about mining that a lot of people don't realize. The miners are actually closer to the community than almost any other industry. They're in very remote locations often. And they're usually the main employer wherever they are. And they played a role in development in terms of often hospitals, schools. They're intrinsically connected to the community. So when something like this happens, they respond, and they can't help it because the company is is more attached than almost any other kind of industry to both the land and the community where it's located. It literally can't do its job without them. It can't be independent. It can't be upped and moved to another city or another country or another state. That attachment is very fundamental to the nature of the mining industry. And because of that, when things like this happen, they have to respond. They have no choice, or else they'd have no workforce. They'd have to close the business down. So I think I saw a lot of places where they were seriously helping the community, because the mining industry is intrinsically a part of every community, more so than most industries. And they had no choice. And so they stepped up because that's what they had to do.
Right. Annie, maybe use some of you and then your personal investment in board.
Yes, I just want to support everything that was said today, but I also want to make the point that this does not only have to be associated with producing mines. Exploration companies have just as an important role to play. And I'll give you a real example. I'm on, as you know, on the board of Crest. And last year when the COVID hit Mexico, we were front and center with educating the communities what it all meant. Our employees volunteered to stay behind and help the communities. We provided the supplies for them to make the masks. We provided the cleaning supplies. And then they were the ears to the ground. What does that mean for the local community? So the community was concerned that we're going to import the virus to their area. So what we did, we were in the midst of doing a feasibility study for our silver gold mine. We had to change the design. We had to design a camp that is now being constructed. It's a one-man room camp, right? So we're having the protocols fully compliant within the system. We also procured a testing machine to be able to actively monitor our employees and contractors. And we have very strict protocols. And now we're in the midst of construction. So all that kind of a thinking about how do we best integrate community concerns so we actually are successful costs us about 15 million extra to address those concerns. But what does that do? That gives us the social license to operate. Now communities trust us because we've taken everything in our control to prevent the spread of the disease. We've helped them, we've engaged with them, and now this is a KPI that is part of the corporate KPI. This is how the governance gets integrated. So I'm giving you an example of a culture. We're building a culture of care, a culture of engagement with local communities, but not only that, stakeholders. When I talk about engagement, the ESG is not just about local communities, it's about engagement with the governments, engagement with investors, being able to explain how the steps taken will have long-term positive impacts on their returns, because now we can build this mine faster, on time, and with everything that is in our control. Yes, there's an upfront capital to it, but now I think that all the investors will appreciate the valuation upside that will come from the timely delivery of that project. So these examples are very important because we were just exploration company last year. Now we're developing a mine in the midst of COVID. So this is how we need to tell our stories better, because a lot of the companies are doing so much on the ground, but maybe that does not get quite front and center and does not quite get reflected in the valuations. So I think over time we'll get better at that with the proper disclosures, but I think investors will start recognizing that the companies that do the right things and have the right governance to monitor the E&DS and will have a better cost of capital. That means the capital availability will be there for them and the cost of that capital will be lower.
Nikolai, if I look at Dundee, what have you done we talked about communication, what have you at Dundee done to better communicate all that local effort that has been going in, and that's not last year. I mean, this has been building over time, and actually to be that helping hand in the time of crisis. What have you done to convince investors that Dundee is doing a good job on the ground?
Well, I guess we were focused first on helping again the partners that we are in together, and as Amanda was saying, the local communities, just making sure that together we can manage the situation. That was our primary focus, and haven't really thought that much. We're going to communicate that. I think what came out of that, of us again working together, we were stronger, and the communities were able to manage better the situation with COVID where we are. We as a business was able to manage the situation in a way that there was no really interrupt of the processes. I think that speaks really volumes in terms of the approach and what we've done. So we were very careful of not making it as a too big. This is our accountability as a being a reliable neighbor, and being able to rely on this trust. You're really there to support when the need hits, and there is no again, there is no need of making this a big story. We were quite actually the other way around, just making sure that we are there to help, we are there to support. This was visualized in us being able to go through the challenge together with the local communities in a very effective, very efficient way. But from DPM perspective, we were very careful of how much we communicate. Obviously, we were providing input in terms of what we are doing and the impacts that we are facing. But the primary focus for us was how can we help and how can we work together to go through that together with the partners.
Rolling up the sleeves and get the work done, and I've seen that across many of our clients. But Alex, maybe based on your experience, what can be done sort of in future to help the story? Because bad press about mining companies is abundant, right? I had one client where the only thing you can find about them is a 25 years old spill, and it's very hard to get that off your first hit on Google. So Alex, any thoughts there?
Sure. Yeah, no, I speaking with companies certainly, and I've had more prior experience broadly in extractives industry than the oil and gas industry, but the same kind of large infrastructure builds occur, and you oftentimes have corporate executives kind of lamenting the fact that why isn't all the commitments we're making on the ground factored into ESG scoring, the building of roads, all the social development that occurs. And it's funny, that's not necessarily reflected at all in some of the dominant third-party scoring systems. But I'd say, I don't know, there's no dearth of ways really to demonstrate commitment, right? I mean, obviously industry groups like ICMM have been promulgating standards for a while now for their largest founding members and trying to raise up the group. But groups like Responsible Mining Foundation, they have the Responsible Mining Index, which allows miners to show their commitment by getting scored across all kinds of dimensions, economic development, business conduct, life cycle management, community well-being, working conditions. And it's all with the idea of ongoing engagement to improve along those dimensions and get rewarded by the marketplace accordingly, right? I could even plug our own organization briefly, the Emerging Markets Investors Alliance. We have roundtable forums for engagement between investors and miners on critical issues. And then you can include a whole abundance of groups with its series or Climate Action 100. There are all kinds of vehicles to make public commitments and commits more transparency around particular disclosures. So, that might be beneficial.
Amanda, I think your research has guided a lot of insights. So in terms of, index and accounting for some of that local work on the ground. Why hasn't that sort of yet triggered? Or, you know, would you recommend the mining industry to push their own ESG standard that elevates that?
Look, the industry as a whole, the institutions, and actually the actual miners have been asking for a long time for a comprehensive set of standards, because there's a lot of standards and companies do a lot of things. I think the new IRMA, the responsible mining certification that Daimler, Chrysler, and Ford have recently signed up to, is going to be along the lines of what happens. But fundamentally, there's ESG, it's environmental, social, and governance. And part of that is you need to have a relationship, not just with the land or the territory that you're extracting from, but the people and the communities and the governments where you're also extracting it, and the infrastructure that you're putting in. You have an effect, they're intrinsically connected. And I think some of the new standards that are coming out are going to cover that better than they have in the past. It's not a perfect system. And I think even investors are not necessarily clear. Horrible stuff makes the news, right? Like the worst offenders in our industry make the news. The vast majority, and I do mean the vast, at least 95% of the mining companies that are producing or actively developing a mine follow all of the rules of their environmental and social impact study, and actually give back far more in terms of real economic development, even in the developing world, than they necessarily get any credit for. I think we need to find a way to measure it better, and the investors are looking for they see the worst offenders. They don't see the daily headlines saying 95% of the 1,000 mining companies operating all over the world are doing a great job providing the raw materials that is the basis for all of our economic development. That doesn't make the news. That's kind of boring. But the horrible mistakes are unfortunately broadcast on the news regularly. And I think that a reporting standard for ESG, which is slowly coalescing, pushed by both investors and the societies and the government, are going to come up with that new reporting standard slowly but surely. They're evolving, and they will consider all of that, because I think it is really important not just to stop the offenders from doing the bad things and prevent the accidents and the horrible things that do happen in the mining industry from happening, but giving credit to the ones that do it right. And there's a lot more of them than people realize.
And you know, I think you picked up the Daimler, Chrysler, Ford. Are there other ways for miners to differentiate themselves so they're not dragged down by bad press from incident aggregation that sort of happens in the industry? Any thoughts from your side there?
Better and consistent disclosure. We cannot wait for standards to come together. I mean, there's so much work being done now behind the scenes with a lot of the standard bodies. They're all collaborating to come up with global standards. They're talking, they're taking into consideration the European taxonomy. They're talking about the materiality overlays. So there's enough standards out there, including the mining specific standards, that eventually they're going to come together with one set of overarching standards. But not, I'm advocating for not waiting. So every company has their own top 10 material drivers that will impact their ability to operate. So focusing on those and designing the proper oversight and governance structures to manage those issues, and be front and center and open about those challenges and achievements in that direction. I think this is crucial. This is why company-wide ESG scorecards that are very transparent and are seen from the frontline employees all the way to the boards are the way to go, because then it's very clear what are the priorities for that organization. I have to compliment that the mining industry actually is doing a pretty good job of tying now these ENS into the executive compensations. I think on average, the mining companies, about 20% of executive comp now represents factors that are associated with health and safety, with environmental stewardship, with community engagement, and so on and so forth. Is it perfect out there? No. And one big company misstep, such as Rio, could shed a very poor light on the G side of the equation. And as you could see recently, not only the executives, but board members are also departing, given what happened last year. But that does not take away from the positive developments that have happened, as Amanda mentioned. We need to talk about that. So we need to elevate the work that we do. We need to better quantify the social impacts, the positive impacts we have. There's such a great second and third derivatives from the in-country operations through procurement of local supplies through local employment and so on and so forth. So we need to better quantify those. And the one overlay that we are all learning now about is this climate change impacted. So how is that going to be impacting our businesses? I can give you an example. For example, at Golden Star, we're starting to talk about the carbon impacts and the cost of carbon. And that will now become part of our capital allocation decisions, kind of considering what are the impacts. So being proactive is what I am advocating for, understanding what is important and being open and transparent with the disclosures. That shows the culture and the commitment throughout the organization.
I would also
Amanda,
quickly
go
mention that Annie mentioned it, and I think that that is a real, 5 years ago, ESG being reported to the board was, in the mining industry, was reasonably rare. Almost every, and it's not mandatory, it's definitely not part of the requirements of any listing standard that I know of, but most mining companies I know have, or the directors of them, have started asking for monitoring and reporting on a regular basis to the board on all matters ESG related. And I think that's a show of the industry sees where it's going. They do the work anyways. They're literally on the mine face, at the coal face, dealing with the communities and the environment in which they operate, and they are reporting on it. And the directors of these companies expect that reporting now, and that's without being forced. I would like to see more global standards. I think coalescing those standards is important in the long run, but as Annie said, the companies don't need global standards to know what the right thing to do is, and I think most of them, they see the writing on the wall and they're very happy to move towards it.
Right. And I mean, even if you take the bad news, you take the Rio example, right? I mean, what's interesting is the board has actually moved, and the CEO had to step down on this, right? Similar, Vale had it was Brumadinho, same consequence, right? And you can almost say, like, look, in the financial crisis that happened in 2008, none of the CEOs really in the big banks have actually lost their CEO position. So, there's a different realization, actually, the mining industry holding themselves, despite disasters, up to a higher standard from that perspective. Would you resonate on that, or how do you see, how would you react to a comment like that?
Was that directed to me?
Any takers?
Look, as an organization in which our theory of change revolves around influencing investors and educating them on sustainability issues, and they in turn applying a pressure on their portfolio companies. I think what we've seen is that in the mining segment, investors increasingly understand the major risks in a way that they haven't in the past, maybe. We did a study for our investors that combined the global incident data from MSCI and Sustainalytics, right? And by combining a bunch of categories around community consent and labor relations and land use and water risk, we found that stakeholder relation risk events were occurring globally about once every 3 days, and while Amanda's right, the vast majority of operators are doing the right thing. About 33% of mining companies are involved in one incident or another, and the proportion, importantly, the proportion of mining company value that's threatened by stakeholder relation controversies in terms of portfolio exposure is also around 30%. And I think that's being internalized by investors, right? The mining industry, along with other extractive industries, are really just by nature, intrinsically, by virtue of what they do, are really exposed to more ESG risk than certainly financial institutions or others. So it's shined a spotlight on it, and I think you've seen heightened kind of investor interest as a consequence.
So
yeah, if I may, just a few comments in terms of the frameworks, and I agree. It's one of the front runners in terms of transparency. We had a sustainability report from 2011, one of the first company who had it as an externally verified. But that's at the sort of the end of the story. And in order to get performance, you really need to be acting on the purpose of the company and strategy and how you are integrating all those things. So a framework that we are looking at recently is this 6 capitals framework, and we believe it provides a very powerful way of transforming the image for the whole mining industry, because we're still yet calling ourselves an extractive industry, and we are not an extractive industry. We are a development industry, and what we do, we are transforming natural capital into human capital, in a social and societal capital, in an intellectual capital. And I think as an industry and everyone in the value chain, we need to do a better job in trying to communicate that. And in order to be able to communicate that better, we need a better accounting of the movements of all these capitals. So we are very good at measuring the return on the financial capital. But what about the return on the natural capital? So when you go out and develop a mining project, you are borrowing a natural capital. But as a company, you have the accountability to design the project in a way that you return on this natural capital when you close the mine and rehabilitate the site. And you can deliver a return on that natural capital by designing the closure in a way that you actually make the ecosystem better. You make the habitats better. You make the ecosystem services more resilient by the way how you design that. So we are on this journey and trying to evaluate all those, and we made a commitment actually that we will be making sure that the net positive impact from our operation is the net impact from our operation is positive, and taking into account all these capitals, not just the financial capital and return to the shareholders, but taking into account all the other capitals, all the other dimensions in this complex world that we live.
So in a sense, then the E, the S, and the G has basically their own capital framework in your view.
You actually, I'm not sure that you can differentiate the E from S, and it's so integrated, and I think just pulling out 1 or 2 parameters and focusing on them, it doesn't really serve you a good job, because the important with all this is that everything is so interconnected that you need to have a perspective of how, if you are focusing on one thing, it will affect you on the other side. So you need to really have this holistic view, and as a management approach, if you need to focus on one thing, you need to be very cognizant on when you need to start focusing on the other things. Otherwise, you might be pushing in one direction, and then you forget some of the interdependencies, and they will at the end hurt you.
Annie, you look like you wanted to add to that.
I'm of an agreement, but it would take a cultural shift, I think, Nikki, and I think this is a journey. This is not an overnight success. We need to slowly start to integrate and maybe not so much reinvent, but realign the components of our businesses to fit this framework that you're talking about. I am of an agreement that we need to rethink how we think about our businesses and how we balance it. Because from a director's point of view, we have a fiduciary duty to oversee the safety of all assets, including the human capital asset, the natural assets, the social assets that we touch and we integrate. So having that balanced approach to balancing all stakeholders' interests, including the environment, if you take it as a stakeholder, I think this is critical. And again, this is a journey. This is not a sprint.
My suspicion is that oh, sorry. I was just going to ask everyone, my suspicion is that and we've been talking about this for the last 5 years, the battery minerals issue and the EV transition, I kind of feel that's going to lead to a fundamental reframing of perceptions around mining because of the essential aspect of that and how important that transition is going to be globally.
I think when it comes to technology, there's an adoption curve and it starts really slowly. And we actually hit this sort of 2.5% penetration for both for EV and actual usage of renewable power kind of recently. And once you hit that, the entire curve changes. And so the demand is vastly changing. And that demand is coinciding with, it's almost it's what Nikolai said before. The new generation, the new dominant generation of voters and people in the working world are millennials, or people that are closer to millennials than they are to the generation before it. And previously, the growth cycle globally, I think people were reasonably ignorant of how important a role resources played in economic development and the cost. The true cost, if you frank the intangibles like the environment and the community of getting it out. And now that the focus of the main consumer group in the world is on doing it better than it was done before, every aspect of how our businesses are being run is changing. I think the real issue that is kind of the elephant in the room, as it were, is how hard it's going. The previous generation was growth at any cost, which meant taking a lot of shortcuts when it came to environmentalism. And those shortcuts are what caused some of the disasters that have made the headlines. Those mistakes were made 20 years ago. They were just paid for and made the headlines today. And that shows you the depth and the length of the mining industry and how intrinsically connected they are and how doing things right from the beginning is important. But I think the other thing we really need to consider as an industry is how are we going to fix to put it bluntly, greenwashing is hard. Building it right from the beginning, the way in the recent past, the way Dundee and Silvercrest have done, we've been on this train for a while and we're partially part of that sort of new millennial generation that are doing that. But the issue that we as an industry need to be very careful of is the old companies, the ones who did it in a different context, in a different time, to different standards, which are going to affect all of us going forward. So we might be doing it right now, but when tailings dams collapse, they collapse 20 years later. And that's something we really as an industry need to find a way to manage.
Alex, you had in an earlier conversation with me mentioned there's for some of the frontier markets in particular, there's opportunities to leapfrog in getting it right. Maybe something to comment on.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's right. It's an interesting perspective because our work is with institutional EM investors, right? So we see a lot of the different, it highlights a lot of the differences between developed markets and emerging market investing and what's going on in these various countries. And, certainly the movement toward a global middle class, the raising of standards across countries, the rise of that middle class is occurring primarily in the Brazils, the Indias, the Chinas of the world. And what every middle class demands are the same thing that one in developed markets, clean air, clean water, and so those standards and a demand for that are certainly going to continue. And the one thing that I don't think people completely appreciate is the willingness of a lot of these countries to, as Amanda said, do things differently. You know, the leapfrogging effect, we talked a little bit about wireline versus wireless technology in Africa, and how since they didn't have an entrenched installed base of wireline telephony, they could go straight to some of the most modern technology. And similarly, in a lot of emerging markets in frontier countries, there isn't an established, say, oil and gas industry, you know, in which to compete. And so they can go directly to renewables technologies. So, you know, this provides an opportunity, and spending in those markets reflects that. It's actually eclipsed spending in developing economies. And so it's an important trend to consider, no doubt.
So we're coming to the end of our session. So I was wondering if every one of you would like to give sort of a final statement and something they would particularly have at their heart. So maybe Alex, since you already started, maybe I'll put you on the spot here first. Sure.
Well, I mean, look, we've been kind of an enthusiastic endorser of ESG incorporation into the investment process. And, you know, one thing you observe, especially, you know, we're talking about the various pillars, you know, among investors, there's increasingly a consensus around the governance aspect that it's going to flow from the culture of the company, right? And so that's why investors, especially in EM, are very focused on getting to know, largely getting to know management and their real commitments to various endeavors. And from that culture flows the governance. And then in turn, the implementation of E&S policies is going to flow from governance. But, you know, the thing with ESG data, of course, is the kind of the difference between binary kind of yes/no policies, and 80% of the E&S metrics are simply, do you have a policy in place or not, right? So do you have a CO2 policy? Yes. But actually only about 25% of miners actually report emissions, right? Do you have an equal opportunity policy? Yes, we do. 60% say that, right? But only 26% report on employee turnover. And what we've tried to impress upon miners is that, you know, what we're seeing is that there's actual outperformance. And funny, there was a study that we kind of that we did with Goldman, in which we saw about 247 basis points of outperformance, and it was over the last 9 years on a 3-year rolling basis on hard metric improvements, right? And in fact, companies that are disclosing more non-quantifiable policies actually perform slightly less well than the rest that don't. So it's, I would say, thing to focus on really are the kind of substantial trackable metrics which can demonstrate improvement. And I think it's certainly increasingly what investors are looking at. And I think it behooves miners to kind of think about it and get on board early to kind of shape the dialogue between investors and their perceptions about it and what matters, because it's not asymmetric, obviously, because a lot of things maybe what investors focus on aren't appropriate. So that dialogue between investors and companies is extremely important, and for companies to get the word about what they internally value and what they're prioritized moving forward and why they think that's important.
I think I'll jump in and say my point of view on the market generally, and the mining industry specifically, is that there's a sort of universally between both the investors and the miners themselves, there's an agreement that the next generation of mines need to be sustainable, and that growth at any cost is no longer acceptable. And I think that everybody's on board with it, from civil society to investors to governments, to the miners themselves who are at the coalface. We want, in a post-COVID world, this consensus is there that we want to build it back, but we want to build it back better, and we want to build it back greener. And we need to find a way to do that. And I think universally what you're also hearing on this call is that if it's measured, it's managed. And the way to do that is to measure our performance in all of these E, S, and G, which are all intrinsically connected. And that is how we manage it going forward, to make sure that the next generation of growth is done in a sustainable manner.
I will pick up on that, and I say we are faced with a lot of sustainability challenges, and the way to find solutions is by bringing the diverse set of skills, experience, knowledge, and perspectives that come from inspiring all kinds of cultures and gender to come to the leadership roles. We have still a long way to go to support and educate women throughout our organizations, and to promote freedom of thought and collaboration. So I think the way we'll find solutions if we work together throughout all levels of the organization and bring more diversity throughout the organizations.
Just a few final comments. I think just picking up on what Annie said in terms of everything being a journey, I totally agree with that. The challenge that we are facing and that we will face more and more is that the speed is becoming quite high and over sort of increasing speed. So from our perspective, we will welcome any collaboration from any of the stakeholders that are to the mining industry, and we can't solve the issue by ourselves. It really requires a very close collaboration and working together with again the communities, the regulators, the investors. So it's really again a call for action among all of us. As more we collaborate, as better we will manage this transformation, and at the end of the day, we will respond collectively as businesses and as investors also to the societal requirements, and those societal requirements are here to stay, and they will be driving the changes that we will see coming. So it's really a call for collaboration and moving forward faster.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think that concludes our session on ESG, and it's a pleasure to have you all here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.